The city of Rome had always been a place of stone and fire, a living machine of people, markets, temples, and theaters. By the middle of the 1st century, it was already the beating heart of an empire that stretched across seas and mountains, its streets full of shouts, songs, and the clattering of carts over cobblestones. Yet in the year 64, that heart seemed to stop. A fire began somewhere near the Circus Maximus, the great racing track where thousands came to watch the chariots thunder by, and in the dry summer heat the flames grew wild. They leapt from roof to roof, devouring wooden beams, collapsing balconies, and swallowing whole neighborhoods. The city burned for days, smoke blotting out the sun. Families fled through alleys with what few possessions they could carry, while soldiers and slaves struggled in vain to push back the fire with buckets of water and torn down buildings used as fire breaks. By the time the flames had calmed, vast stretches of Rome lay in ashes. Entire districts were gone. People spoke in whispers, some in grief, some in anger, and all of them wondering what would come next. For many, the disaster felt like an ending, as if the very soul of Rome had been wounded beyond repair. But for Nero, the young emperor who sat upon the throne, the fire seemed to open a door. He was no ordinary ruler, and he was not remembered as one who saw things the way most men did. Nero looked at the scorched earth where the old neighborhoods had stood, and he saw a possibility. Where others mourned loss, he imagined creation. Where charred ruins smoked, he envisioned gardens, fountains, and halls so splendid they would outshine any palace built before. The people of Rome whispered that he had sung of Troy burning while his own city was in flames. Whether that story was true or not, it lingered in the air, shaping the way they thought of him. Yet Nero, untouched by rumor, already dreamed of something that would change the very landscape of the capital forever. To understand why Nero would dare to raise such a palace, one must know the kind of man he was, or at least the way he thought of himself. Born into the Julio-Claudian line, he was steeped in both privilege and danger. From his youth he had been taught that emperors were not just men, but figures of destiny, meant to embody the wealth, culture, and power of Rome itself. He loved music, theater, and poetry, often preferring the stage to the battlefield. To some of the senators and generals, this made him seem weak or unworthy, too consumed by the pleasures of art to understand the burdens of rule. But in his own heart, Nero felt that Rome should be a place not only of conquest and law, but of beauty. After the fire, that vision took root in a way that would surprise even his closest advisors. The idea was simple, but immense. To construct a house so grand that it would not seem like a house at all. It would be a palace that spread over hills and valleys, stretching across the very center of Rome, embracing nature as much as stone. He called it the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. The name itself hinted at what he had in mind. Gilded walls, shimmering halls, ceilings that reflected candlelight like sunlight, and rooms that would leave visitors in awe. But this was not to be a fortress of power or a cold monument to authority. It was meant to be a place of wonder, of leisure, of indulgence. Gardens would bloom where houses once stood. Artificial lakes would mirror the sky, and a dining room would spin slowly like the heavens themselves. Such things had never been attempted on this scale before, to the common people. Even the idea seemed like something out of a dream. When the first plans were drawn, the scope of the project shocked even the most seasoned builders. The architects chosen for the task were Severus and Celer, men of rare imagination, who were unafraid of Nero's wildest requests. They were told not to think of what had been built before, but to imagine what might be possible. If stone and concrete could be bent to human desire, Rome had known aqueducts, arches, amphitheaters, and triumphal roads, but this was different. This was not a structure for the public or a gift to the state. It was personal, extravagant, and limitless. Nero gave them freedom to experiment, to test, and to indulge. In their hands, the ruins became a canvas, and every design sketched upon it was bolder than the last. The foundations of the palace spread across the Palatine, the Esquiline, and the Cillian hills, swallowing land that had once belonged to private citizens, temples, and markets. To some it felt as if the emperor was erasing the memory of the fire with his own will. Whole blocks of Rome were cleared, their owners compensated or forced aside, depending on their standing. In their place rose marble colonnades, pillared halls, and vast courtyards. Walkways wound through orchards and vineyards, where peacocks strolled and fountains splashed gently into pools. The contrast between what had been cramped streets filled with vendors, laughter, and daily struggle, and what now appeared open spaces, carefully manicured and glittering with wealth, could not have been starker. Rome was changing, and it was changing in Nero's image. As work continued, the people whispered among themselves. Some said the palace was proof that Nero had indeed set the city aflame, for how else could he have found such space for his dream? Others defended him, saying that the Golden House was not a selfish act, but a promise of renewal, a chance to rebuild with grandeur after devastation. The Senate, however, saw things differently. To them, the palace was an insult, a reminder that the emperor valued his own pleasure above the traditions of the republic and the dignity of the state. Still, even they could not ignore the marvels being created. They might grumble, but they also came to see, and when they did, their eyes could not help but widen at the scale. The project was not merely architectural, but almost theatrical in its execution. Nero wanted Rome to become a stage where beauty unfolded at every turn. Gold leaf shimmered on ceilings, ivory and precious stones lined the walls, and delicate frescoes painted with landscapes. Mythological scenes and fantastical creatures stretched across corridors. The artists brought into the palace were told to let their imaginations flow, unbound by tradition, as if they too were actors in Nero's vision. What resulted was unlike anything Rome had ever seen. The very air inside the Golden House seemed perfumed with strangeness. A place where time itself slowed, where one could almost forget the weight of the world outside. The centerpiece of all these wonders, however, was yet to come. In the heart of the palace, Nero commanded that a dining room be built that would turn gently, as if carried on the movement of the earth. Guests would recline at couches laden with food and wine, and as they feasted, the ceiling above them would shift slowly, decorated with stars and skies. Perfume would be sprinkled from hidden ducts. Petals would drift down like rain, and the very room itself would seem alive. To dine in such a space would be to step beyond ordinary life, to enter something close to a dream. For Nero, this was not luxury for its own sake, but a kind of theater, where emperor and guests became players in a grand performance of pleasure. Outside the palace walls, the city carried on, scarred but alive. Vendors still called out in the markets, soldiers still marched in formation, priests still carried sacrifices to the temples that remained. Yet there was an unease beneath it all, a sense that Rome itself was being reshaped into something unfamiliar. The Golden House was not hidden, not secluded in the countryside. It rose in the very middle of the capital, impossible to ignore, impossible to escape. And so, whether one hated it or admired it, every Roman felt its presence, as if Nero's dream had spilled into their daily lives. At night, when the torches flickered along its colonnades and the fountains whispered in the dark, the palace seemed to belong not to Rome at all, but to another world entirely. Some said it was a wonder, others a blasphemy, but all agreed that it was unlike anything they had ever known. And as the first stage of construction stretched on, the Golden House became less a vision and more a reality. Rising from the ashes of the fire as both monument and accusation, both dream and shadow, Rome had offered before. Ordinary homes were built to shelter, temples were built to honor the gods, and theaters were built to entertain. But this palace was none of those things, and all of them at once. It was shelter that felt limitless, like living inside a dream of luxury. It was a kind of temple, though not one devoted to Jupiter or Mars, but to beauty itself. And it was entertainment too, as every turn of a corridor, every mural on a wall seemed designed to captivate the senses. The Romans, who were allowed in, spoke of marble so white it glowed, of vaulted ceilings painted with vivid scenes that seemed to move when the torchlight flickered, of fountains hidden behind walls that whispered as one walked by. It was not just a palace, but an experience, something that seemed to press gently against the imagination of every visitor. The scale alone was staggering. Estimates vary, but many ancient accounts suggest the Golden House sprawled across more than 200 acres, an expanse that stretched over hills and valleys in the middle of Rome, where once narrow streets had been packed with crowded tenements. Now, wide gardens stretched, filled with orchards, groves, and lawns that seemed to carry no end. In a city where space was precious, where families often lived stacked one above the other in tall insulae that could collapse in a fire or flood, His openness was shocking. To walk through the gardens of the Golden House was to step into a different reality, one of abundance, space, and calm. And yet, for all its beauty, the memory of the burned neighborhoods lingered, haunting the very ground upon which Nero's palace rose. The gardens themselves were not meant to imitate nature as it was, but nature as it could be shaped by artifice. Man-made lakes shimmered in the sunlight, designed to catch reflections of the palace walls, so that water and stone seemed to echo each other. Fountains arched streams high into the air before they rained down again, glittering like liquid silver. Artificial grottos invited guests to step inside and feel the coolness of rock and shade, even in the hottest summers. Paths were lined with flowers carefully chosen to bloom at different times, so that no matter when one visited, the air was always scented with fresh fragrance. Peacocks strutted freely through the grounds, their feathers flashing with color, while exotic animals were said to have been kept within enclosures, as if to remind all who visited that the empire's reach extended far beyond Italy. And then there was the colossal statue. At the entrance of the complex, rising higher than rooftops and looming over the city, Nero ordered the construction of a gigantic bronze figure of himself, styled after the sun god. Later emperors would reshape it, renaming it the Colossus. But in its first form, it was a declaration that this palace was more than a home. It was a universe centered around Nero. To see the statue was to feel the emperor's presence magnified, not only as ruler of Rome, but as something close to divine. Some admired the audacity, while others recoiled at what they saw as blasphemy. Yet no one could deny its power. Inside the palace, the halls stretched endlessly. Frescoes covered every surface, and not just in ordinary patterns. Artists had been told to paint with abandon, to fill ceilings with landscapes that opened into blue skies, to create illusions of windows where none existed, to let mythical creatures crawl across the corners of rooms, blurring the line between real and imagined. This was not decoration meant to fade into the background, but art that demanded attention, art that enveloped the viewer and drew them deeper. One could lose themselves in the painted details, following a bird through painted branches, or tracing the folds of a robe across a frescoed goddess. Romans used two plain walls or simple mosaics. This was a different world altogether. What most astonished visitors was how the palace seemed to embrace light. Large openings let the sun spill across polished floors, so that rooms glowed in shifting tones depending on the hour of day. At night, when torches and oil lamps were lit, the gold leaf on ceilings and walls reflected the flicker of flame, scattering warmth across the chambers. Light seemed alive inside the Golden House, always moving, always shifting. It gave the sense that the palace itself breathed, changing mood as the hours passed. In the dim glow of evening, guests reclining at couches might feel as if they were inside a dream. The boundaries between architecture and imagination softened by shadow and gold. The dining halls were wonders in themselves. Some were vast enough to hold banquets for hundreds, with long couches arranged so that every guest could recline comfortably while slaves moved quietly among them, offering platters of meat, fish, fruits, and sweets. Musicians played from alcoves carved into the walls, their notes drifting gently across the air. Perfumes were sprinkled from hidden mechanisms above, mixing with the scents of food and wine so that the very air seemed designed for indulgence. But at the center of it all was the famous rotating dining room. Counts tell us that this room, designed with ingenious engineering, slowly revolved so that guests experienced a sense of movement as they ate, as if the earth itself were turning beneath them. Above, a ceiling painted with stars moved in harmony, so that the diners felt as if they were seated within the heavens. To dine there was to experience time differently. Hours melted away unnoticed as conversation, music, and laughter mingled with the slow revolution of the room. Petals of roses drifted gently down from openings above, carried on breezes of scented air. Wine flowed freely, cooled with snow brought from distant mountains. And rare delicacies were served. Flamingo tongues, oysters from distant seas, honeyed fruits, roasted game. Guests were overwhelmed, not just with food, but with the feeling that they had stepped outside ordinary life and into a play written by the emperor himself. For Nero, who loved the theater, this was the ultimate performance. Even the private chambers of the Golden House were built to astonish. Bedrooms were painted with night skies and oceans so that sleepers felt surrounded by endless horizons. Baths flowed not only with water, but it was said, sometimes with wine or milk, an indulgence that blurred the line between myth and reality. Corridors opened unexpectedly into gardens or pools, so that one never knew where a turn might lead. It was a palace designed not only to impress, but to surprise, to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar. The entire space was alive with the intention of wonder, yet for all of its beauty, the palace cast a shadow. Many Romans resented it, seeing in its grandeur the proof that Nero cared more for his own pleasures than for his people. They remembered the fire, the crowded streets that had been consumed, the lives lost, and they looked upon the Golden House as a monument to selfishness. Others, though, found themselves seduced. How could they not? To walk through its halls was to forget the world outside, to believe, if only for a moment, that one was living in a paradise shaped by human hands. The Golden House divided Rome, not only in its physical space, but in the hearts of those who gazed upon it. For Nero himself, however, there was no division. The Golden House was his vision brought to life, his chance to leave behind something eternal, something that would make his name live on in memory as more than just an emperor, more than just a ruler. He believed he was creating not only a palace, but a statement, a kind of poem written in stone, water, and gold. And as construction continued, he spent more and more time within its walls, drifting from chamber to chamber, lingering in gardens, listening to music, and reciting verses, while surrounded by beauty that seemed to echo his own sense of grandeur. And so, as Rome healed from fire, as its people rebuilt their homes, as senators argued and merchants carried on with trade, the Golden House grew. It stood not only as a palace, but as a mirror of its creator, reflecting his dreams, his flaws, his genius, and his excess. To step inside was to step into the mind of Nero himself, into a place where art and indulgence knew no limits, where the line between reality and imagination blurred, until it became impossible to tell one from the other. As the Golden House expanded, Rome itself seemed to shift around it. The old rhythms of the city still pulsed in the markets, along the Tiber's banks, and in the bustle of the Forum. But the palace drew attention like a flame draws the eye in darkness. People came from across the empire, not only to trade or to serve in the Senate, but to catch a glimpse of the marvel that Nero was creating. Travelers whispered of gilded ceilings that sparkled like dawn, of gardens that seemed endless, and of banquets where wine and song flowed like rivers. These stories spread quickly, and though not all who heard them believed, the very exaggeration gave the Golden House a mythic quality. Even those who despised Nero could not help but be curious. For it is human nature to wonder at wonders, even when they inspire resentment. In many ways, the palace reflected the tension of Nero's reign. He was a ruler who longed to be loved, yet often ruled in ways that invited fear or suspicion. The Golden House captured both sides of him. To some, it was proof of generosity, a vision of beauty given to the heart of the empire, a place where art, light, and nature blended to uplift the human spirit. To others, it was arrogance made visible, a colossal reminder that their emperor had taken land once filled with citizens, homes, and transformed it into his own playground. In this contradiction lay the essence of Nero, a man who could sing of poetry one moment and order executions the next, who could build wonders while alienating those meant to admire them. The palace's engineering itself was a kind of theater. Hidden mechanisms moved panels of ceilings so that flowers and scents could rain down. Water pipes and fountains were arranged in ways that concealed their sources, so that pools seemed to bubble with life on their own. Doors were designed to open smoothly, walls curved to catch echoes of music, so that the sound of a lyre could linger as though in conversation with itself. It was a place that seemed to perform, not in the way a play unfolds on stage, but in the way every detail was meant to surprise, to enchant, to create an atmosphere of endless possibility. For Romans used to the sharp order of basilicas, or the stern symmetry of temples, this playfulness felt almost magical. To walk through the Golden House was to be guided gently from one world into another. One corridor might open suddenly into a courtyard filled with vines and birdsong. Another might lead to a chamber where the walls shimmered with mosaics of sea creatures, as if one had stepped into the depths of the ocean. A turn of steps might bring you into a hall painted entirely in soft blues and whites, with light spilling from above to mimic the sky, while the next room would dazzle with reds and golds, images of gods and heroes glimmering in torchlight. Every part of the palace told a story, not through words, but through the careful interplay of stone, water, paint, and imagination. Visitors often remarked that time seemed different inside. Hours passed unnoticed, as though the palace existed outside the ordinary measures of the day. Guests who entered at noon might emerge at dusk without realizing how much of the sun's journey had gone by. This timelessness was not accidental. Nero wanted his guests to feel suspended, caught between reality and dream, as if they had stepped into an eternal festival. The palace was designed to be a kind of sanctuary from the ordinary, a world where pleasure and beauty were endless, where concerns of politics, commerce, and struggle could be set aside. For the emperor, this was not escape, but fulfillment, the belief that life could and should be lived surrounded by constant wonder. Still, not all who entered the Golden House felt comfort. Some senators, invited reluctantly, walked its halls with tight jaws, their eyes taking in every jewel and fresco as evidence of excess. They thought of the treasury stretched thin, of legions who needed pay, of citizens who had lost their homes. To them, the glittering walls were not signs of inspiration, but of waste, a mockery of Rome's traditions. Rome had been built on discipline, on the strength of its armies and the simplicity of its founding myths. And here was their emperor bathing in milk and dining beneath a rotating ceiling. They returned to their seats in the Senate chamber with sharper tongues, their hearts heavy with quiet anger. But others could not resist the charm. Artists, poets, and musicians saw in the Golden House a validation of their own passions. Here was an emperor who gave them freedom, who demanded not restraint but creativity, who encouraged visions as wild as his own. They flourished under Nero's patronage, producing works that might never have been made in a stricter reign. For them, the Golden House was not indulgence but opportunity, a space where imagination was king. And though history would judge Nero harshly in these moments, surrounded by art and music, he must have felt understood. The people of Rome themselves remained divided. Some admired the gardens, strolling among them when allowed, grateful for the chance to enjoy greenery in the middle of the city. Others spat at the very mention of the palace, convinced that it was a theft from the heart of the people. For every Roman who dreamed of its wonders, another Roman cursed it under their breath. The Golden House was never neutral, demanded a response, and that response was always bound up with how one saw the emperor himself. As seasons passed, the palace became a constant subject of gossip, stories growing taller with every retelling. Some claimed that the ceilings sparkled with real stars captured from the heavens. Others swore that the lakes could change color, glowing silver by moonlight and gold by day. Children imagined it as a place where gods walked in secret, and old men muttered that no good could come of such arrogance. The truth was already remarkable enough. But human memory has a way of turning marvel into myth, and the Golden House was perhaps the greatest stage for such invention. For Nero, the palace was not merely about grandeur, but about legacy. He knew that emperors were remembered as much for their buildings as for their deeds. Augustus had left temples and forums. Claudius had built aqueducts. And Nero wished to leave behind something that would eclipse them all. The Golden House was not only a home, it was a statement to history, a declaration that in his time, Rome had touched perfection in art and indulgence. He might not win his name through conquest or through law, but through beauty, and for him, that was enough. At night, when he reclined in the rotating dining room, or strolled the gardens lit by torches, Nero must have felt the satisfaction of a man whose vision had come to life. Around him, laughter rose from banquets, music floated on the air, fountains sparkled with moonlight, and the colossal statue of himself loomed against the stars. For a moment, he was not only emperor but creator, master of a world shaped by his will. The Golden House was no longer a dream. It was real, it was vast, and it belonged to him. But reality, like light in the palace itself, shifts with time. The Golden House could dazzle and it could seduce, but it could not erase the memory of fire, nor silence the muttering of senators, nor change the hearts of those who believed the palace stood as proof of tyranny. The story of Nero's Golden House was still being written, and though for now it glowed with the sheen of gold and wonder, shadows were beginning to gather at its edges. In the years after the fire, As construction on the Golden House pressed onward, Rome itself struggled to find its footing again. Entire districts had to be rebuilt, and though Nero promised new streets, wider avenues, and safer homes, the shadow of his palace always loomed. For the citizens laboring to put their lives back together, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Their walls rose from stone and timber, modest and practical while not far away. Gilded halls and perfumed chambers spread across the hills. Each hammer strike in the neighborhoods was an echo of survival, but each column raised in the Golden House was a reminder of the gulf between emperor and people. This tension simmered quietly, unspoken by many but deeply felt, like a slow ember that refused to die out. Yet within the Golden House, the mood was altogether different. The work of architects Severus and Celer grew bolder with each passing season. They experimented with arches that curved in ways no one had dared before, with vaulted ceilings that seemed impossibly light, with subterranean chambers that cooled naturally even in the height of summer. Roman engineering was already a marvel in its aqueducts and amphitheaters, but here it was pushed to new limits. Every challenge became an invitation to create, every request from Nero an opportunity to imagine the impossible. The palace was not only a monument to indulgence, but also a workshop of innovation, where form and function intertwined in ways that would influence builders long after Nero himself was gone. Beneath the surface of the palace lay another secret. The underground rooms, built partly into the hillside, were decorated not with heavy grandeur, but with delicate, almost playful frescoes. These images, painted in fine detail, showed whimsical landscapes, floating figures, and fantastical creatures. Unlike the more formal art of temples or civic halls, these paintings felt intimate, dreamlike, even mischievous. Centuries later, when artists of the Renaissance stumbled upon these buried rooms, they would marvel at the style and call it grotesque. Inspired by the grotto-like chambers where it was found, without intending to, Nero's Golden House planted seeds of inspiration that would bloom in art long after the empire itself had crumbled. But in Nero's time, the palace was still alive with sound and movement. Banquets filled its halls with laughter, music, and the clinking of goblets. Poets recited verses by torchlight, their words echoing against painted walls. Actors performed small plays within the gardens, their voices mingling with the whisper of fountains. To be invited into the Golden House was to be given a taste of paradise, an experience so far removed from the crowded tenements and noisy streets that it must have felt like stepping into another world entirely. For Nero, who longed to be not only ruler but artist, these gatherings were his stage. Every guest, every performer, every musician became part of his grand production, a living theater of indulgence. The centerpiece of this indulgence remained the rotating dining room, that marvel of engineering that seemed to defy the limits of stone and wood. Guests reclined on couches as the ceiling above them turned, painted with skies and constellations, giving the illusion that they feasted beneath the heavens. Rose petals floated down, perfumes drifted through hidden vents, and the very air seemed alive with sweetness. It was said that guests left these banquets dazed, not only from wine, but from the overwhelming sense that they had been transported beyond ordinary life. In a city defined by struggle and survival, such experiences were as rare as they were intoxicating. Still, even wonder can breed unease. Among Rome's elite, whispers turned to grumbles, grumbles to criticism. The Golden House was too much, they said, too vast, too indulgent, too brazen. It was not the palace of a ruler, but the playground of a child who had never known restraint. And though they might admire the engineering or marvel at the artistry, they could not set aside their unease. To them, the Golden House was not simply an expression of Nero's vision, but a symbol of a deeper flaw. A ruler so consumed by beauty and pleasure that he neglected duty, justice, and the welfare of his people. The palace, in their eyes, was proof of his failings. Yet for the common people, the judgment was not so clear. Some hated the palace as fiercely as any senator, seeing in it the reason their families lived in shadows while Nero dined beneath stars. But others felt a strange kind of pride, however reluctant. Was it not their Rome that housed such a marvel? Did it not prove that their city remained the greatest in the world, even after the fire? Foreign envoys who visited returned to their homelands awestruck, carrying tales of golden ceilings and perfumed chambers. In this way, the Golden House elevated Rome itself, even if its benefits were unevenly shared. For many ordinary Romans, this contradiction lingered unresolved, shaping how they spoke of the palace in hushed tones late at night. The palace also began to shape the emperor's daily life. Nero spent more and more time within its walls, drawn away from the business of governance. Surrounded by beauty, flattered by poets, and celebrated by musicians, he seemed to drift further from the harsher realities of empire. The struggles of the provinces, the demands of the legions, the balance of the treasury. In the Golden House, those concerns faded like distant echoes. Here he was not weighed down by politics, but lifted by song and light. To his critics, this was proof of neglect. To his admirers, it was evidence that Nero lived as an artist first, a ruler second. Either way, the palace became the center not only of his reign, but of his identity. Even the seasons seemed different within its grounds. In spring, blossoms filled the air with fragrance, carried on breezes that rippled across the artificial lakes. In summer, shaded porticos and underground chambers offered cool relief, while fountains played in endless arcs of water. In autumn, the orchards and vineyards within its gardens bore fruit, gathered by servants for the emperor's table. And in winter, fires blazed in marble hearths, reflecting their warmth off golden walls. To live within the Golden House was to live within a world that softened the sharpness of nature, bending each season into something pleasing, gentle, and indulgent. Yet beyond its walls, Rome carried on in harsher rhythms. Soldiers marched to distant borders, merchants haggled in markets. Farmers bent over fields outside the city. Senators debated laws, governors issued edicts, slaves toiled in silence. The empire's great machine turned endlessly, sustained by discipline, labor, and sacrifice. Against this backdrop, the Golden House seemed almost unreal, a dream set down in stone at the heart of a restless empire. It was a dream that fascinated and unsettled in equal measure, one that revealed as much about Rome's future as it did about Nero's present. And so, as the palace grew to its full splendor, it stood as both marvel and omen. Its gardens, lakes, and halls shimmered with light, music, and laughter, but its foundations were laid on ashes, and its walls carried whispers of resentment. The Golden House was both Rome's pride and Rome's burden, a wonder that could not be ignored, and a shadow that could not be escaped. It was not just Nero's palace anymore. It was Rome itself, dazzling, divided, and destined for memory. As the Golden House neared completion, the palace seemed less like a construction project and more like an entire world, unfolding inside the heart of Rome. Its gardens spread so widely that visitors sometimes lost their bearings. Wandering among pathways that wound through orchards and over bridges arched above glittering streams, the air was full of birdsong, some from creatures brought from distant lands, their calls strange and enchanting to Roman ears. The lakes mirrored the sky, and when the wind was still, one could gaze into their surfaces and almost believe they opened into another realm. This sense of otherworldliness became the defining character of the Golden House, a place not bound by the same limits as the city that surrounded it, a place that seemed to float between reality and dream. It was said that Nero himself would wander through these gardens at night, surrounded by a small retinue, reciting poetry to the moonlight. The emperor was no soldier by heart, though he commanded legions, nor was he a statesman by nature, though he held the empire in his hands. He saw himself instead as a performer, an artist, and the palace gave him the stage he had always desired. In its marble courtyards and gilded halls, he could recite verse, pluck the strings of a lyre, or sing in the company of musicians, with the echo of fountains lending rhythm to his performances. To him, the Golden House was not a retreat from Rome, but a stage upon which he might finally be who he believed himself to be. Those who were present at such evenings described a strange blend of splendor and intimacy. The emperor, dressed not in armor but in flowing robes, would sing softly, his voice carrying through painted chambers where gods and heroes looked down from the walls. Lamps flickered in golden holders, their flames mirrored in polished marble floors, and the fragrance of roses drifted from hidden ducts. For a moment one could forget that this was the most powerful man in the world, and see instead an artist desperate to be heard. It'd be admired not for conquest, but for creation. The Golden House gave him that chance, though it also deepened the distance between him and those who believed an emperor's duty was first to rule. In truth, the palace was as much theater as dwelling, Every wall, every corridor, every chamber seemed designed to surprise and delight. To turn the act of walking into a performance, one might enter a room painted as though it were open to the sea, then step into another where the ceiling glittered with constellations. One hall might feel as wide as a forum, while the next felt like a grotto hidden in some distant countryside. The transitions themselves became part of the experience, keeping the visitor in a state of wonder. To live in the Golden House was to live inside a story, written not with words, but with stone, water, paint, and light. But while the palace dazzled those within, outside its walls, resentment grew heavier. The Senate remained wary, their patience stretched thin by what they saw as extravagance. Nero's enemies whispered that the emperor had allowed the fire to burn unchecked, precisely so he could clear land for his dream. These rumors spread like smoke through the city, impossible to contain, and though they could never be proven, they lingered in every conversation. To ordinary citizens who had lost their homes, the sight of gold and marble rising where their neighborhoods had been felt like salt rubbed into an unhealed wound. Beauty and bitterness became entwined, the Golden House glittering in the sun, even as dark mutterings grew beneath it. And yet, there were those who defended it, pointing out that the palace brought work to countless laborers, artisans, and craftsmen. The fire had left thousands idle, and in the years that followed, many found employment carving marble, painting frescoes, building arches, and laying mosaic floors for Nero's vision. The Golden House, extravagant as it was, also fed families, trained apprentices, and gave artists opportunities they might never have known otherwise. To these defenders, it was not simply a palace, but a source of livelihood. A grand project that drew Rome's creativity together into something the world would not forget. In this way, the palace became a paradox, both symbol of loss and engine of renewal, both wound and balm. Nero himself seemed untouched by the criticism, or perhaps unwilling to hear it. Surrounded by flatterers and artists, he absorbed only praise, convinced that the Golden House would secure his legacy as a creator rather than a tyrant. He imagined future generations walking through its halls, marveling at its wonders, speaking his name not with curses, but with admiration. For him, the palace was more than stone and gold. It was the vessel of memory, the stage upon which he hoped to remain eternal. And in this belief he was not unlike many rulers before and after him, who sought to outlast death by the monuments they left behind. Still, the Golden House could not remain sealed off from Rome forever. Each banquet, each performance, each gathering echoed outward into the city, shaping how Nero was remembered. Foreign dignitaries carried tales of its marvels back to their homelands, their voices half in awe, half in disbelief. Senators returned from its halls more determined in their opposition. Ordinary Romans, glimpsing its walls from afar, carried mixed feelings: envy, pride, resentment, wonder. The palace became a mirror of Rome itself, reflecting the divisions of a city that could never quite decide whether to love or despise its emperor. By day, sunlight poured across the colonnades, catching the edges of fountains and gilded walls, making them shimmer like fire. By night, the glow of torches spread across marble courtyards, their light mirrored in pools of water, turning the gardens into a place of quiet enchantment. In every season, in every hour, the Golden House revealed a new face, as if it were alive, adapting to time and mood. It was this living quality that made it unforgettable, as though the palace itself shared in the breath of those who walked within it. Yet behind all the wonder, behind the gold and marble, the palace remained fragile, not in stone but in meaning. Its beauty was undeniable, but beauty alone could not protect Nero from the currents of politics. The tempests of discontent, or the judgments of history, the Golden House stood brilliant and unshaken. But the man at its heart was vulnerable, his reign already swaying beneath the weight of suspicion and disapproval. Now, the palace shone as brightly as Nero had dreamed. But in the distance, shadows lengthened, and the story of the Golden House was far from complete. The Golden House, for all its splendor, was never merely a palace of stone and gold. It was a statement written across the very center of Rome, and as the years passed, that statement grew louder in the minds of its people. For those who admired Nero, it was a triumph of imagination, proof that Rome was not only the capital of power, but of beauty, a city where art could live on the same scale as empire. For those who despised him, it was a monument to indulgence, a scar upon the city, built at the expense of tradition and dignity. Both views carried truth, and together they gave the palace its strange power. It was loved and hated, admired and condemned all at once. Within its walls, however, none of these judgments seemed to intrude. The Golden House lived in its own world, one of constant festival. Banquets followed banquets, music echoed through marble chambers, fountains whispered their endless songs. To those who entered, the weight of the city outside seemed to vanish. Here, there were no quarrels of senators, no unrest of crowds, no worries of grain shortages or distant wars. There was only the glow of gold, the shimmer of water, the fragrance of flowers, and the sound of laughter. The palace became a kind of dream, carefully maintained. A world where time itself slowed, as if the emperor wished to hold eternity in his hands. Nero reveled in this dream. Surrounded by poets, actors, and musicians, he embraced the life he had always longed for, not as a ruler, but as an artist. He performed often, sometimes before guests, sometimes before small circles of friends and flatterers. He sang, played the lyre, even acted upon stages built within the palace grounds. For him, the Golden House was more than home. It was theater, and he was both playwright and star. To his critics, this was vanity, unbecoming of an emperor. To Nero, it was fulfillment, a chance to live not as history demanded, but as his heart desired. Guests who witnessed these performances left with mixed impressions. Some were charmed, even moved, by the emperor's passion. They saw in him not the stern ruler of Rome, but a man who yearned to be understood, who poured his soul into song and verse. Others felt unease, sensing that the emperor was too lost in his illusions, too distant from the realities of governance. Yet even the skeptics could not deny the beauty of the setting. To watch Nero perform in a hall where frescoed skies stretched overhead, where fountains whispered nearby, and where rose petals drifted down from hidden ducts, was to witness something unforgettable, whether one admired or despised the performer. The palace itself seemed designed to reinforce this sense of performance. Corridors curved and opened unexpectedly, guiding visitors as if through acts of a play. Rooms dazzled with shifting themes, one painted as if open to the heavens, another adorned with seashells and dolphins, another glowing with scenes of myth. Every step was a surprise, every chamber a revelation. One could not walk through the Golden House without feeling part of a story, drawn into a spectacle greater than oneself. This was its greatest magic, and also its greatest flaw. For while it enchanted, it also revealed how far Nero had drifted from the stern traditions that had once defined Rome. Outside, the city's mood darkened. The fire of 64 was not forgotten, and many still muttered that Nero had played his music while their homes burned. Whether true or not, the rumor clung to him like smoke. The Golden House, rising on the ashes of that disaster, became a constant reminder. Each gilded ceiling, each jeweled wall, each perfumed garden seemed to accuse him in silence. To his enemies, the palace was proof enough that he had cared nothing for the suffering of his people, only for his own dream. They saw in it the measure of his selfishness, and in their anger, the palace became a symbol not of beauty, but of betrayal. Yet still, others found wonder in it. Foreign envoys marveled at its splendor, poets sang of its marvels, and ordinary Romans, when allowed inside its gardens, sometimes stood speechless at the sight of fountains and flowers blooming in the very heart of their city. Beauty, after all, cannot be wholly denied, even when it is born of suspicion. For many, the Golden House was both a marvel to behold and a source of resentment. They could not love it, but neither could they forget it. It remained, like the emperor himself, an enigma. As seasons turned, the palace grew into the rhythm of Rome itself. Spring filled its orchards with blossoms, summer brought shade beneath porticos and coolness in underground chambers. Autumn colored its vineyards with fruit, and winter warmed its golden halls with firelight. Guests arrived and departed, banquets came and went, but the palace itself remained constant. Shimmering with the light of torches by night and gleaming with sun by day. In this constancy, it seemed eternal, as if it would always dominate the heart of Rome. no matter what storms might gather around it. But storms were gathering. Beyond the walls of the Golden House, dissatisfaction grew louder. Senators whispered of plots, generals fretted over loyalty, citizens murmured of neglect. The palace, for all its beauty, had become the clearest symbol of what many saw as Nero's failings. They did not see innovation in its arches, but extravagance. They did not see inspiration in its frescoes, but arrogance. The Golden House, in all its wonder, had become a mirror, reflecting not only the emperor's dreams, but also the city's discontent. Still, within its chambers, the dream continued. Nero reclined in the rotating dining room, surrounded by music and laughter, as petals drifted down and perfumes filled the air. He strolled through gardens where torchlight shimmered on lakes, listening to poets recite verses that praised him as both emperor and artist. He believed, perhaps, that this dream could last forever, that the Golden House would secure his name for eternity, that beauty could silence resentment. For a time within those golden walls, it seemed almost possible. Yet history has a way of breaking even the strongest illusions. The palace would not vanish, but its meaning would change, shaped not only by Nero's vision, but by the judgment of those who came after. For now, it gleamed with splendor, alive with music, water, and light. But already, beyond its gardens, shadows deepened, and the empire itself stirred with unrest. The Golden House, for all its marvels, was built on fragile ground, and though its walls stood strong, the man who dreamed it stood on the edge of fate. The palace glowed through another spring, and for a while it seemed that the Golden House could outshine any cloud that rose over Rome. Yet news drifts even into gardens where music plays. Whispers have a way of finding corridors no architect can seal. The city murmured about plots and letters, about friends who were not friends, about names spoken quietly in porticos at dusk. Inside, the fountains still sang, but the air carried a new caution. Invitations were weighed more carefully. Footsteps paused a heartbeat longer before doorways. The Golden House did not lose its beauty, only some of its innocence, the way a mirror learns that it can also reflect worry. Advisors who had once spoken freely now chose their words as if selecting rare stones. Seneca's absence felt like a room gently closed, a lamp turned low and set aside. Those who loved philosophy said the palace was poorer for his calm voice, even if the walls kept their gilding and the ceilings kept their painted skies. Nero continued to prefer the company of artists, singers, and designers, the circle that shared his appetite for spectacle, but the balance had shifted. A ruler can retreat into art for comfort, yet art does not erase the responsibilities waiting beyond the garden gates. The builders did not slow. Sferus and Celer pushed Roman concrete into shapes that made engineers frown, then smile in spite of themselves. They experimented with round rooms and slanting passages that guided air like a tide. In a cluster of chambers near the heart of the complex, they framed an octagonal hall where light could fall from above and pour down the walls like water. The opening at the crown of the room became an eye that watched the day pass, a gentle reminder that even stone answers to the sun. Workshops thrummed like hives. Plasterers smoothed walls, while painters mixed lime white with mineral blues and greens. The small brushes danced, outlining vines that curled across borders and birds that seemed ready to take flight if one looked away. Mosaics appeared underfoot in patient tides of tiny stone, their tesserae set by hands that had learned the rhythm of fitting one bright fragment against another. In the time it took for a story to travel from the Forum to the Subura, another border was finished, another ceiling sealed, another room breathed into the world. Outside the palace, Rome kept rebuilding herself with a new kind of order. Streets were widened so carts could pass without scraping timber. Porticos were set to give shade and space, and regulations urged brick and stone where once wood had tempted flame. Tenements rose with more caution, and lanes met at cleaner angles. People grumbled about rules as people do, then admitted that wider streets made it easier to carry a basket home, and that brick walls slept more safely at night. The city had learned from fire, as cities do, and part of that learning was visible from the garden paths of the Golden House. Still, not every lesson soothed the provinces. Governors wrote of levies, of roads in need of repair, of soldiers who had waited too long for pay. In faraway towns, the name of the emperor arrived on the same ship that carried news of taxes. The Golden House was famous in places where its scent would never be breathed. And fame is a thin blanket for those who feel the wind. Rome's reach was long, and a long reach requires many steady hands. When any of those hands tremble, the tremor travels farther than the trembler expects. Within the palace, the revolving dining room remained the favored stage. Guests reclined while the ceiling drifted through painted skies. The soft turn of the floor blurred the boundary between stillness and motion, so that even quiet conversation felt like sailing. Perfume rose in faint breaths. Petals fell like unhurried snow. If there was anxiety in the world, it paused outside the threshold each evening and waited there, patient but unwilling to leave, the way night waits for the last torch to go out. Nero's love for Greek games drew him toward the east. Crowns awarded for song and performance shone in his imagination as brightly as any laurel won by a general. When he traveled to compete and to be praised, he found a reception that sounded like approval and felt like relief. The roar of a theater is a flattering tide. It lifts a performer in a way a decree never can. In those months, the Golden House became a little quieter. Watched by stewards who knew how to keep the water clear and the paths trimmed, even when the master of the stage was away. The applause that follows an artist is a living thing, but the loyalty that steadies an empire lives on a different diet. Legions along the frontiers kept their accounts of hardship and tally marks no liar could erase. Commanders measured patience against distance and duty against pride.
Wow.
Letters traveled slowly, and slow letters give worry time to grow vines. Back in Rome, the Senate sat straighter, not because it loved more, but because it feared many possible tomorrows and hoped to guide the city into the least painful one. The palace did not ignore this mood, though marble cannot frown. Protocol tightened at the gates. The guest list grew slightly smaller. The performances leaned inward, toward those who had always adored the music and the color. Even then, the artists kept working. A new panel of ivory inlay glowed like a quiet lake at dawn. A fresco of Persephone stepping into spring gave a corridor the feeling of a small rescue. The best craftsmen understand that beauty is not a luxury. It is a way for breathing to continue when dust rises. There were nights when the emperor walked alone under the torchlit pergolas with only a few steps behind him to mark that he was not entirely solitary. The artificial lake held the stars with unusual kindness, and the wind off the water was cool. In that stillness, the palace seemed to do exactly what he had dreamed it would do. It turned worry into a softer shape. It taught the air to carry music. It made time forget its sharpest corners and brought back the urge to make something lovely while morning was still far away. In quiet chambers, the architects marked new ideas with charcoal, drawing circles inside squares, then squares inside circles, testing how a building could feel like a garden and a garden like a room. The painters prepared more panels of grotesque ornament, delicate and playful, unaware that centuries later someone would discover them by candlelight and smile at their lightness. The Golden House was not only a present joy and a present scandal, it was also a patient gift to a future it could not imagine, a reminder left in the earth for hands that did not yet exist. And the days went on, as they always do. Markets opened at dawn. Wheels rattled over stone. Priests led small processions past facades that had seen so much change they no longer argued with it. The palace kept its glow. The city kept its pulse. Somewhere between the two, the story learned to breathe in a slower measure, preparing itself for the turn that every story meets when the season changes and the light with it, not with a shock, but with a steady, undeniable drift. The summer sun lingered longer on Rome as the palace entered its maturity. The Golden House no longer felt like a project still being stitched together, but a living organism, complete and vast, breathing with fountains and shifting with torches. The people who walked its gardens saw no scaffolds anymore, only colonnades glowing in the heat, reflecting their brightness into the pools below. To the casual eye, it looked timeless, as though it had always stood there, yet beneath that illusion lay the fragile truth. This was a palace barely born, already carrying the heavy weight of rumor, resentment, and awe. Nero himself grew more inseparable from its walls. He spoke of it as if it were a companion, not just stone and marble, but a partner that mirrored his spirit. He invited musicians to perform not in theaters, but in his gardens, their notes drifting across artificial lakes like ripples of wind. He hosted feasts in the rotating dining room, watching guests marvel as the heavens shifted above them. At times, he even spoke of his palace as a gift to the people, a claim that left many shaking their heads in silence. The irony was bitter. The same citizens who had lost their homes to fire were told they should see wonder in the emperor's private paradise. Yet some did. When the gardens opened briefly to the public, when peasants could walk shaded paths and hear the splash of fountains in the heart of a city that usually pressed too tightly around them, strange hush often came over the crowds. For a few hours, they were no longer hemmed in by tenements, no longer chased by smoke and labor, but bathed in green light and water. Children chased one another across lawns, lovers paused beneath vines, and old men leaned against balustrades to breathe in the quiet. These moments left memories, and though they could not erase resentment, they softened it. For beauty has a way of reaching even those who curse its source. Beyond Rome, the world grew restless. Letters from the provinces spoke of strain, of soldiers uneasy with their emperor's passions, of governors who doubted his focus. The empire stretched across continents, and each border carried its own storm. Grain shipments faltered from Egypt, and whispers of discontent reached Spain and Gaul. Nero's gaze, however, remained fixed on art, on performance, and on the perfection of the Golden House. He had made his palace into the center of his life, and for him, the empire revolved around it. As surely as his dining room revolved beneath painted skies, the Senate, watching, grew sharper in its judgment. To them, the palace was not a marvel, but a monument to neglect. They saw every gilded ceiling as stolen coin, every perfumed banquet as stolen bread. And though many of them had dined in its halls, though many had marveled at its artistry, their admiration curdled quickly into accusation. Rome, they argued, had been built by men who carried swords and plows, not by emperors who played lyres in painted ceilings. To them, the Golden House was a betrayal of Roman identity, a glittering shell wrapped around decay. But the palace did not care for politics. Its fountains flowed, its halls echoed, its gardens bloomed. The painters continued their work in hidden chambers, frescoes of vines and masks curling across walls where only the emperor's closest companions would tread. Architects experimented with new vaults, testing the strength of concrete in ways that whispered of futures they could not imagine. Musicians rehearsed in shaded courtyards, their melodies blending with the splash of water and the call of birds. Life within the Golden House unfolded in a rhythm untouched by unrest, as if the palace existed in another Rome altogether, one built of dream and song. At night, the palace became something else entirely. Torches lined the gardens, their flames mirrored in the lakes, so that fire seemed to float upon water. Marble gleamed softly, the gold of ceilings turned warm and dusky, shadows softened the extravagance into something gentler. Guests walked slowly beneath pergolas, their conversations quieted by the beauty around them. It was said that in these hours, even Nero grew calm, his restless spirit soothed by the illusion that he had captured eternity. He spoke more softly, his voice carrying less command and more longing, as though he wished only to remain within that dream forever. Yet time has no patience for dreamers. The empire beyond the palace walls pressed on with demands. Soldiers still needed pay, merchants still needed roads, citizens still needed grain. The Golden House could not feed an empire, nor could it quiet discontent with painted ceilings. The palace was real, but the world outside it was more real still, and slowly. The gap between Nero's vision and Rome's needs widened into a chasm. For now, the Golden House glittered without blemish, but beneath its glow, cracks were beginning to show. Not in stone, but in faith. The people remembered the fire. They remembered their homes turned to ash, their families scattered, their lives rebuilt on scraps. Each time they passed the colossal statue at the palace entrance, each time they glimpsed gilded walls gleaming in sunlight, the memory returned, sharper than marble. The Golden House was not simply beauty, it was also a wound. It was both a garden and a grave, both a wonder and a scar. This duality clung to it, shaping how Romans spoke of it for years to come. Still, in the quiet of its gardens, in the music of its fountains, in the scent of its blossoms, the palace seemed eternal. It seemed untouchable, immune to fire, rumor, or politics. Guests would walk its paths and feel certain that it would stand forever. no hand could erase it, that Rome itself would crumble before the Golden House faded. Such is the power of beauty. It convinces the heart that it cannot be undone. Yet history would prove otherwise. Even wonders gilded with gold cannot escape the hands of time, nor the judgment of those who come after. For now, though, the palace shone. Its colonnades glowed in sunlight. Its lakes mirrored the heavens. Its ceilings shimmered with painted stars. Within its walls, Nero still dreamed, still sang, still believed that through art and beauty he could write his name into eternity. Outside its walls, Rome stirred uneasily, restless, divided, waiting for the story to turn. The Golden House stood between them, both a marvel and a warning, both a triumph and a prophecy. The Golden House still shone in the heart of Rome, but by now its glow no longer softened, the shadows gathering around the emperor. Whispers of conspiracy had grown sharper, no longer mere murmurs, but dangerous voices weaving through the Senate and the streets alike. Nero, who once filled his nights with music and feasts, began to hear discord in every silence. The same palace that had once been a refuge of art now became a kind of cage, its gilded walls unable to keep out the weight of suspicion. For a man who loved performance, the stage of Rome was turning against him. The Pisonian conspiracy was among the first cracks to show how fragile his power had become. Senators, equestrians, and even officers had plotted to remove him. And though the conspiracy was uncovered, its revelations spread fear like smoke. Seneca, once his tutor and the voice of philosophy at his side, was ordered to take his own life. His quiet departure left a void that no painted ceiling or perfumed banquet could fill. The Golden House echoed with song and laughter still, but beneath it lay the hush of absence, the silence of trust undone. Nero's private life, too, carried sorrow. Poppaea, his beloved empress, died under circumstances so heavy with rumor that truth was lost in shadow. Whether accident or cruelty, her absence darkened him. The Golden House, with its gardens blooming and fountains whispering, became a place that reminded him of what he had lost, even as it tried to console him. 8. The halls painted with myths of love and triumph began to feel like echoes of stories slipping beyond reach. Beyond Rome, storms swelled in the provinces. In Gaul, Vindex rose in rebellion, his voice echoing the frustration of governors and soldiers, who had grown weary of an emperor more concerned with art than arms. In Hispania, Galba watched, cautious but restless, and began to weigh his own chances at rule. The Golden House might have been a theater where time stood still, but the empire could not pause for beauty. Grain shipments, frontier battles, and the loyalty of legions demanded attention that Nero could no longer command. The Senate sensed this weakness, and their whispers turned bolder. Once they had sat under gilded ceilings with polite restraint, careful not to offend the man who ruled them. Now they measured their words less carefully, for they had begun to see the possibility of another future, one in which the Golden House would be remembered not as a marvel, but as the folly of a fallen ruler. The same halls that once impressed them now became fuel for criticism. Every mosaic and fountain turned into evidence of extravagance. Nero himself tried to answer unrest with the same tools he had always loved: performance, generosity, and spectacle. He lowered taxes, he promised games, he offered gifts to the people. But even these gestures, once enough to charm, now fell flat. The city had changed. Hunger, rumor, and resentment made the crowds harder to soothe. A rotating ceiling and showers of rose petals could not quiet men who feared for their livelihoods or senators who schemed for power. Still, the palace continued its rhythm. Banquets were held, music was played, frescoes were finished in hidden rooms. Guests still marveled, though now their marvel was tinged with unease. They laughed at the emperor's songs, though sometimes their laughter carried more obedience than joy. Even within the Golden House, where the air was perfumed and the fountains sang, there was a sense that the dream was faltering, that the world outside could no longer be kept away. When Vindex fell and Galba declared himself emperor in Hispania, the balance shifted sharply. The legions, once the steel of Nero's reign, hesitated. Some held to him, others drifted. For an emperor, nothing is so fragile as loyalty, and once cracks appeared, they spread quickly. Nero retreated further into his palace, wandering its torchlit gardens, reciting lines to himself. listening to musicians play as though beauty could still hold the empire together. The golden house had been built to make him eternal. Now it began to feel like a sanctuary for a man already fading from the stage. The Senate turned against him openly, declaring him an enemy of the state. Once he had been adored as the center of Rome's grandeur. Now he was cast out as though he had never been emperor at all. The colossal statue at his palace entrance seemed almost to mock him, towering above the city even as his power collapsed beneath it. He fled the city that had once been his stage, leaving behind the palace that had embodied his vision, as if walking away from his own reflection. In those last days, as he hid outside Rome, he was said to have asked despairingly whether any would remember him for his art. The golden house stood silent behind him, its gardens still blooming, its fountains still singing, even as the man who dreamed it prepared for death. When word came that soldiers were approaching, Nero ended his life rather than face capture, whispering that the world would lose an artist in him. With that, the dreamer of the golden house was gone, leaving behind a marvel that had already become burden. Rome, in the days that followed, did not know what to make of the palace. Some saw it as cursed, the very image of a reign gone astray. Others marveled still, unable to deny its beauty even as they cursed its creator. But one thing became clear: the golden house would not remain untouched. The city, restless and pragmatic, would soon decide its fate, reshaping it not as Nero had intended, but as Rome itself demanded. After Nero's death, Rome breathed a long, uneven sigh. The Senate proclaimed Galba emperor, and the city shifted uneasily into a new chapter. Yet the golden house still stood, too vast to vanish overnight. Its colonnades and gardens gleaming in the sun, as though nothing had changed. For those who passed its gates, the palace seemed almost indifferent to its creator's fate, continuing to whisper with fountains and bloom with flowers, even as the man who dreamed it was gone. But in truth, the golden house had already begun its slow descent into shadow, not because of the stones themselves, but because of what they meant. The new rulers of Rome could not embrace it. To them, the palace was not a marvel, but a stain, a reminder of indulgence, arrogance, and the emperor they had cast down. Its beauty was undeniable, but beauty itself can be dangerous when tied to shame. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and eventually Vespasian all looked upon the golden house and saw not a monument to Rome, but a symbol of Nero's excess. They understood that as long as it stood in its full glory, it would whisper his memory back into the city. That was something Rome could not allow. And so, the dismantling began. Gardens were cleared to make way for new projects. The artificial lake drained to prepare the ground for an amphitheater that would soon overshadow every other building in the empire. Where once peacocks strutted and fountains sang, stone arches began to rise. The beginnings of the Colosseum. With every block of masonry laid, Nero's dream was buried a little deeper, replaced with a structure that spoke not of indulgence, but of spectacle for the people. The Golden House in this way became the foundation of Rome's most famous arena, its memory hidden beneath the roar of crowds. Inside, the palace's chambers were stripped. Precious metals were taken, jewels pried from walls, ivory carried away. What had once glimmered with wealth now dulled into shadow. The vast colonnades fell silent, their echoes no longer filled with poetry or music, but with the faint scuff of soldiers' boots. Parts of the palace were bricked up, others repurposed for storage or workshops. What had been a vision of paradise was reduced to utility, its wonder dimmed by neglect and practical need. Rome, in her relentless way, consumed even this marvel, recycling its bones into her own endless growth. Yet not all of it vanished. Beneath the earth, hidden chambers survived, sealed by time and neglect. Their frescoes, delicate and playful, lingered in darkness long after memory of them had faded from Rome. Centuries passed. The city above shifted and changed, and the Golden House sank deeper into silence. By the Middle Ages, its very existence was little more than rumor, a ghost story told among ruins. The palace that had once dominated the heart of Rome had become invisible, buried in shame, forgotten by all but stones. It was not until the Renaissance that chance returned it to light. A young man exploring near the Colosseum stumbled through a crack in the earth and found himself in strange painted chambers underground. The frescoes danced across the walls, vines, birds, masks, and mythical figures, still vivid despite the centuries. Word spread quickly, and soon artists lowered themselves by rope into the grotto-like rooms, carrying flickering torches to study the strange whimsical style. They copied the designs into their sketchbooks, inspired by their lightness, their play, their refusal to be stern. From these rediscovered frescoes came a new word: grotesque, born from the grottos of the buried Golden House. The greatest artists of the age, Raphael, Michelangelo, and their peers, studied these walls and carried their lessons into the palaces and chapels of their own time. Nero, long condemned, had left behind an inspiration he never intended, shaping art 1,000 years after his death. The Golden House, despised by his contemporaries, became a hidden seed planted in the soil of history, sprouting unexpectedly in the age of rebirth. Even in ruin, even in shame, it had a power that could not be erased. Today, fragments of it still remain beneath the streets of Rome. Tourists walk carefully through dim corridors, guided by electric lamps where once oil flames flickered. They look up at ceilings painted with delicate figures, their colors faded but still alive. They trace their fingers lightly along stone that once glowed with gold. Above them, modern Rome bustles with cars and voices, unaware that below its feet lies the buried dream of an emperor. The contrast is sharp. Life moving restlessly above, history waiting silently below. The Golden House has become a paradox in memory. To the Romans of Nero's time, it was a scandal, a wound, a wonder. To later generations, it was forgotten, buried, erased. To us, it is both, a ruin and an inspiration, a symbol of extravagance and a spark of creativity. Its story is not just of a palace, but of how beauty can survive even when condemned, how art can slip past judgment and find new life in unexpected ages. And so the Golden House endures, not as Nero dreamed, not as Rome feared, but in fragments, in frescoes. In the quiet awe of those who descend into its hidden halls. It reminds us that history is never simple, that glory and shame often walk side by side, and that even the most condemned of visions can leave behind a trace of wonder. Beneath the noise of modern Rome, Nero's dream still waits, silent but not forgotten, a golden whisper in the dark.